Is it possible to be a foreigner in your own home? I discovered that it is. And it hurt more than I imagined. Have you ever felt the weight of hearing from your child that your presence bothers them? That you're just another electricity bill at the end of the month? I heard that. Word for word. And I've never been the same since that day. It was an ordinary afternoon, like any other. I had made lunch, washed the dishes, folded the clothes. My body no longer responds as it used to, but I strive to remain useful. Even so, that day, during a casual comment in the living room, my son looked at me and said, "You just sit around all day, wasting energy." He laughed. His wife laughed too. My granddaughter looked away. And me. I swallowed hard, my soul torn, like someone who had just discovered they had been officially relegated to the role of dead weight in their own home. You know, I used to pay all the bills. Electricity, water, groceries. I even bought my granddaughters gifts. But somehow, all of that was forgotten. Or maybe it never really mattered. Being a present mother, a devoted grandmother, a woman who put her own life aside for her family. It seems that, in old age, none of that matters anymore. And the worst part wasn't just the sentence. It was the feeling of invisibility. The way everyone went back to their phones, the television, as if I were just a piece of furniture in the living room. A piece of furniture that consumes energy. A nuisance. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt that, despite everything you've done, your presence has become uncomfortable? That your voice no longer carries weight? That your story has been erased and replaced by hasty judgments? It hurts in a way no one who hasn't lived it understands. It's a silent pain, one that doesn't scream, but that corrodes from within. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, replaying every memory, every sleepless night caring for my feverish son, every day I gave up living for myself to live for them. And now, this? Being called useless? Being reduced to a couch and an energy bill? This story is just one among so many that no one tells. One among the thousands of stories of mothers who became obliterated, of grandmothers who were erased, of women who became invisible within their own homes. Stories that don't make it to television, but live on echoing within so many families, perhaps even yours. And that's why I decided to speak out today. Because this isn't just my story. It's the story of many. And maybe it's yours too. If you've ever been ignored, humiliated, treated like a burden by those who should care for you, then you'll understand every word that follows. Because that day, after hearing all that, I made a decision. Silent, firm, and definitive. But for you to understand how it all happened, I need to go back in time a little. My name is Ruby, and for many years, my routine was one of silence, sacrifice, and an almost blind faith that it would all one day make sense. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. Quite the opposite. I had to weave my destiny, stitch by stitch, with the threads of necessity, courage, and those decisions we make more with our hearts than with reason. I worked as a seamstress for over 40 years. I started young, when people still called my sewing machine noisy and clumsy. But that noise became my soundtrack, the sound of my livelihood, the sound of a woman trying to raise a child alone in a world that always demanded more than it offered. When my husband left, he left much more than debts. He left a bitter silence, an absence I needed to fill with strength. That's when my true journey began. I rose before the sun, sewed until my fingers bled. I repaired things for neighbors, created wedding dresses for clients who couldn't pay cash, sold clothes door to door, sometimes bartering for food. There was no glamour, only determination. Michael, my son, was raised with the best in me. Not in material things, but in presence. I made a point of being at every school performance, even if it was with my apron still dirty with thread and fabric dust. I baked cakes for his birthdays, even if they were simple. And even when I was tired, I listened to him. I always listened. Even when he grew up and stopped talking. Time passed. Life wasn't kind, but I never complained. Because all I wanted was to see my son well. Graduated, with a career, with a home. And when he married Karen, I felt I'd done my part. I felt proud. I was ready to live my final years in peace, perhaps planting my flowers, perhaps teaching my granddaughter to sew. I just didn't expect life to hold a hidden truth for me, that not every sacrifice is recognized, and that love sometimes fails where it should flourish. When Michael and Karen needed help, opening my home was a natural thing. I didn't think twice. The house was simple but welcoming. Every piece of furniture had a story, and I knew I could give them a more stable start. They came, bringing little Sophie, my granddaughter, and for a while, everything seemed to work. I cooked, helped with schoolwork, paid the bills they couldn't afford. It was my way of continuing to be useful. But little by little, something began to change. And it wasn't just their behavior. It was in the air around the house. Little jokes began to emerge, phrases dropped into conversations, as if I were a silent burden. A weight they carried out of obligation. I still paid the groceries, the energy bills, even the TV streaming service. But that was no longer enough. Their presence filled the rooms, and mine began to fade. What was once my home became a space where I had to ask permission to exist. I began to notice impatient glances and muffled sighs when I sat in the living room. Once, I overheard Michael whispering to Karen in the kitchen, saying, "You need to understand that their pace of life was different. That maybe I no longer fit in." Those words marked me more than any scar on my body. Because it wasn't just about getting older. It was as if everything I'd lived, everything I'd built, had lost value. As if, upon reaching a certain age, I'd become disposable. And no one talks about that. About how hard it is to realize you're there, but no one sees you anymore. And yet, even with this constant feeling of being a nuisance, I persisted. I put coffee on the table before they woke, folded their clothes carefully, prepared lunch with the same spices Michael had loved since he was little. Because part of me believed that, deep down, they still saw. That they still remembered. But life has a curious way of showing us who we truly are to others. And sometimes, the greatest transformation doesn't come from shouting. It comes from silence. From realizing little by little, that it's no longer about what you do for others, but about what you allow them to do to you. And it was at this point in my story that something inside me began to change. A discomfort that grew without a name. A whisper that, day after day, gained strength within me. Until a simple, almost banal gesture was enough to finally break what still held me back. It all started so subtly that, for a long time, I preferred to believe it was all in my head. Small, half-thought-out comments, as if they were just jokes. But they held something behind them. A weight that, little by little, became unbearable. The first time I felt this real discomfort was one morning, while we were having coffee. I, as always, was up before everyone else. I made the coffee strong, just the way Michael liked it when he was younger. I prepared toast on the griddle, and I set the table with a care that came from years of loving repetition. When they sat down, everything was ready. But instead of a thank you, or even a smile, what came was a dry, almost automatic comment. "Did you see how much the energy bill is coming up?" At the time, I smiled. I smiled because I didn't know what to say. And because my heart was still trying to deny what my mind was beginning to understand. He said this, looking at the kitchen light, as if that bulb were there only because of me. As if my presence were the explanation for everything that was wrong. And even without him saying it directly, it was clear. The message was there, raw, hidden behind the word, account. I continued as if nothing had happened. I pretended I didn't understand. I pretended it was just a random comment, a random outburst. But I started paying attention to the details. And it was like pulling back a curtain. I saw everything I didn't want to see. I saw how the towel I'd carefully folded was crumpled with disdain. How the food I'd prepared was eaten in silence, without even a compliment. How the television was turned off as soon as I entered the living room, with excuses disguised as haste. I saw, most of all, how my steps through the house were no longer accompanied by loving glances, but by sighs. As if my presence took up too much space. Weighed too heavily. These were the behind-the-scenes moments of the shift. It didn't happen overnight, but like a poison that spreads slowly, silently. When we realize it, the damage is already done. And the cruelest thing is that, even in the face of all this, I continued trying to please. I continued offering help, buying little things for the house, leaving notes with positive messages. I clung to any sign of connection, like someone trying to hold back water running through their fingers. And deep down, I knew, this was no longer a coexistence, it was emotional resistance. I resisted the pain, the rejection, the certainty that I was no longer seen as someone essential. It was during this process that my mindset began to shift, even though I couldn't yet name it. It was as if a new version of me was awakening. More observant, more attentive to signs, less willing to deceive myself. I began to understand that love, no matter how deep, cannot sustain a relationship alone. And that sometimes the hidden truth of our own family is more painful than any material loss. I remember one afternoon in particular. I was sitting on the sofa, embroidering an antique towel I'd set aside for Sophie. It was a gift. I wanted her to have something I'd made, with my own hands. Michael walked past me and, without even looking, said in a low voice, "She could at least turn off the lights when she leaves the room." The sentence fell like a knife. I wasn't even in the room. But I got the message. Everything about me was bothering me. Even the rooms I passed through. From that moment on, something began to shift within me. And it wasn't anger. It was a kind of clarity that comes when pain no longer needs to be denied. When we stop justifying the unjustifiable. It was as if, for the first time, I was looking at that house with new eyes. Realizing that the furniture, the walls, the smells, everything that had once been a symbol of home, no longer belonged to me. And the saddest thing is that no one had to kick me out. I was slowly being disconnected. First emotionally, then physically. Like an outlet losing power, until the light bulb goes out completely. At that point in my journey, I began to question everything. The choices I'd made, the sacrifices, the silences I'd maintained to maintain peace. I began to see the impact that routine was having on me. Not just on my tired body, but on my soul. I no longer smiled like before. I didn't make plans. I didn't recognize myself. And it was then that I realized something that would completely change the course of my story. Perhaps I'd forgotten myself for too long. Perhaps I'd allowed myself to be treated this way because, deep down, I'd also stopped seeing myself. This revelation, so simple and yet so brutal, was like a snap. A silent shock. And from that moment on, my way of looking at everything changed. Including myself. The transformation that began within me wasn't immediate. It was like a slow fire, almost imperceptible, but consuming everything inside. On the outside, I remained the same hair tied back with a crooked clip, the same floral print blouse, the same care taken when preparing fluffy rice, just as Michael always liked. But inside, I could no longer find that woman who believed everything could be resolved with patience, with silence, with waiting. Waiting was killing me. And with every small gesture, with every phrase disguised as irony, something inside me broke. It was like that until the day it finally broke. It was a Sunday. One of those days we grew up believing was family time. With a set table, good conversation, the smell of food filling the house. I made the effort, as always. I prepared roast chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh salad, and cornmeal cake. Everything with the same care as always, as if believing that care can still heal misunderstandings. They arrived from the street with grocery bags, talking loudly, laughing. Sophie was glued to her phone, Karen was sending audio messages on WhatsApp, and Michael. He barely glanced at me. They sat at the table and began eating as if I were invisible. During dinner, between bites, Michael looked up and said, in that tone that mixed contempt and false lightness, "You suck the atmosphere dry." Like that. Cold. Raw. And worse. As if it were a joke. Karen laughed. That low, shameless laugh that seems to say everything that's never been said. Sophie, my granddaughter, said nothing. She just lowered her eyes. That cut me more than any words. Because I'd seen her grow, seen her first steps, heard her first cries. And now she couldn't even look at me. In that moment, what I felt had no name. It wasn't just sadness, nor just anger. It was an ancient pain. As if all the mothers in the world were with me at that table, listening to that and remembering everything they'd given up. The impact of those words pierced me like a blade. You drain the environment. I, who had always tried to illuminate. I, who had erased myself so they could shine. I, who had been a roof, food, a lap, a shield. Now I was just a weight. A heavy air. A bad energy. I didn't cry. Not then, not later. My body remained still, but inside, my heart seemed to have stopped. It was at that moment that I understood, with brutal clarity, that this was no longer my home. Not because I wasn't paying the bills, or because my name wasn't on the documents, but because there was no respect. And where there is no respect, there is no home. There are walls, there is a roof, there is furniture, but there is no belonging. The hidden truth we struggle to accept is that love doesn't immunize anyone against ingratitude. And sometimes, the worst kind of rejection is the kind that comes disguised as coexistence. The kind that feigns normality but corrodes you a little more each day. I realized I was living in an environment where I wasn't welcome. Where my presence caused discomfort, as if it were a burden everyone wanted to get rid of, but no one had the courage to take on. And you know what's hardest? It's understanding that, even so, we try to justify it. We try to understand. We try to believe it will pass. That it was just a bad day. But it wasn't. This was a reflection of their new mentality. A distorted view where the elderly are obstacles, where mothers are surpassed, where the presence of those who have lived a long life is seen as a shadow, not a light. From that dinner on, I stopped putting extra dishes on the table. Not out of revenge, but because something inside me had been silenced once and for all. I no longer felt part of the story. It was as if I'd been erased from the script. And anyone who's ever felt excluded from a place they helped build knows what I'm talking about. It's a kind of exile no one sees. That night, I lay there without eating. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the emptiness of the house that had once been my home. And amidst the silence, I realized my journey was about to change. But this time, it wouldn't be for them. It would be for me. The next morning, I got up as usual. My shuffling steps crossed the hallway, the same cold tiles of a house that no longer belonged to me in spirit. I made coffee. Not because I wanted to, but because it was what I did. My movements were so automatic they seemed to no longer need me. My body followed the script, but my soul, that was already elsewhere. I put the kettle on, and as I waited for the water to boil, I realized it wasn't just the steam rising. It was also my patience, evaporating without a trace. I sat alone at the head of the table. The cup in my hands trembled slightly, not from physical fragility, but from everything I'd been silently holding on to. The tea was hot, but my heart was lukewarm, emptied of everything that had once burned for that family. I turned on the morning news, as if searching for any distraction, some external noise to drown out the internal screams that echoed ever louder. But that day, not even the noise of the television was enough to silence what my conscience was beginning to say more clearly. I wasn't born to be treated this way. The words from dinner still reverberated like a malignant echo. You suck the atmosphere dry. I wondered how many other mothers, how many other grandmothers, how many women like me had heard such phrases without anyone seeing the aggression hidden within them. Because there is a violence that leaves no scars on the body, but slowly erodes dignity. And this is the worst of all, because no one notices. Only you. That morning, as the tea cooled before me, I began to understand that I wasn't just sad. I was being torn apart from the inside, day after day. And the scariest thing wasn't their rejection. It was how much I had adapted to it. How much I had normalized being diminished, ignored, and made invisible. The revelation hit me like a silent blow. I had let myself be erased. I had erased myself little by little, without realizing it. I had erased my desires, my wishes, my voice. And all of this for love. A love that, at that moment, I no longer knew if it still existed. Or if it existed only within me. I continued my day as if nothing was happening. I washed the dishes, folded clothes, organized the bathroom cabinet. I listened to the conversations in the living room. Laughter that didn't include me. They talked about weekend plans. Going to the park. Maybe catching a movie. No one asked me anything. No one even glanced in my direction. It was as if I were part of the furniture. Useful, silent, and immobile. I pretended not to care. But inside, something inside me had already begun to stir. A whisper that became a scream. An unease that became an urgency. And this urgency had a name. Freedom. That same night, in the darkness of my room, I opened the drawer where I kept some old documents. Household papers, expired checkbooks, an occasional faded photograph of little Michael. I took out a hardcover notebook where, out of habit, I jotted down bills, recipes, and random ideas. I flipped through a few pages until I found the one where I had written years ago, an address I couldn't quite remember where it came from. It belonged to a childhood friend, the kind that time has taken away, but whose name has remained in my memory like a sweet memory. She had written me a letter saying that if I ever needed her, her doors would be open. It was in another city. Far away, but not inaccessible. At that moment, that piece of paper felt like an escape plan. A ransom note. I spent the next few days in silence, observing everything with different eyes. It was no longer the usual routine. Now it was analysis. It was study. I saw time as an ally. Every word, every gesture, every look filled with impatience. All of it became fuel. I didn't victimize myself. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I felt anger. But it was a gentle, organized, strategic anger. An anger that reminded me that there was still something inside me that wanted to live, not just survive. That there was still a woman behind my grandmother, behind my mother. A woman with history, with a past, with strength. I began writing down everything I needed to do. I didn't tell anyone. I became even quieter. Silence became my armor. I knew any hasty move could arouse suspicion. And I didn't want belated compassion, nor forced conversations. I wanted distance. I wanted to leave with dignity, without drama, without warning. They didn't notice. They were too busy with their lives, their screens, their plans. I was no longer part of their world. And that, in that moment, became my advantage. Every journey of transformation begins with a silent decision. And mine began there, with an old notebook and a forgotten memory. The woman I had been for so many years, passive, dedicated, submissive, was no more. In her place, another emerged. Stronger, more lucid, more prepared, and with a plan in place to exit the scene in a way they could never have imagined. That night, I slept with a strange peace. It wasn't light, nor peaceful, but it was mine. It was the peace of someone who had already made a decision and now only needed to put it into action. The fear that had previously paralyzed me now seemed small compared to the strength I had found again. I slept little, but I woke early. The day wasn't even fully dawn when I set foot on the floor and felt something different. It was as if that house, which had crushed me in silence for so long, knew it would be the last time it would see me there. There was no more hesitation in me. There was focus, purpose, direction. I put on my simplest yet most symbolic outfit, that old button-down shirt with small flowers, which Michael gave me on Mother's Day many years ago, when he still called me my warrior. I kept few things. The essentials. A small suitcase with a few clothes, my documents, my medicine, and the old notebook that had now become my escape diary. The rest. Let them decide what to do with it. It no longer belonged to me. I walked through the room like someone crossing a battlefield after the last war. Every corner bore the marks of my presence. The rug I'd embroidered, the lampshade I'd bought at a flea market, the pillow hand-sewn from scraps of the dress Sophie wore when she was 6. Everything there held a piece of me. And at the same time, nothing was mine anymore. The disconnect was complete. What remained now was the most profound revelation of this journey, that too much attachment makes us sick. And letting go sometimes is the only way to heal. I went to the electrical panel and turned off the circuit breaker. Then I walked over to the router and unplugged the Wi-Fi. Not out of malice. Not out of revenge. But because that was my last gesture inside that house. A silent signal that I had been there, that I had paid for every penny of the electricity and internet they consumed, and that, from then on, they would take responsibility. I left an envelope on the table. Inside were receipts for the last bills paid, a spare key, and a brief letter. Not a rant, not a speech, just a few lines saying I was going to live the life I had left, and that I hoped they would find time to reflect on how they treat those who once gave everything. I didn't wish them ill or good. I simply left the truth on paper. I left quietly. The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon, timidly, as if giving me permission to begin again. The air that morning had a different taste. A taste of freedom mixed with a hint of mourning, because, yes, it was also a goodbye. A mourning for the woman I was, for the illusions I'd nurtured, for the hopes I'd silently nurtured. But it was also the birth of a new version of me. More sober, stronger, more aware of its own worth. I hailed a taxi on the corner. The driver was young and polite. He helped me with my suitcase and asked if it was a trip or a move. I replied with a brief smile. Move. He didn't understand the weight of that word. But I did. In that single word was embedded a lifetime of decisions, sacrifices, swallowed pain, and a transformation that began quietly, but was now taking shape. During the drive, I looked out the window with the eyes of someone seeing everything for the first time. The streets, the buildings, the trees seemed greener than before. It was as if the world, too, knew something had changed. The feeling of doing something for myself, after so long of suppressing myself, was liberating. I remembered being young, full of dreams that had been swallowed up by everyday life. I saw myself, for the first time in years, as a woman, not just as a mother, or a grandmother, or a caregiver, but as someone with her own identity, with legitimate desires, with desires that didn't need to be explained or authorized. The new house was small, simple, but it was mine. I bought it with the money I'd saved for decades, hidden even from myself. Money saved with the care of someone who always knew, deep down, that one day I'd need to start over. The key turned in the lock with a sharp click. And when I opened the door, I found no expensive furniture, no new curtains, no smell of a ready home. I found emptiness. But it was my emptiness. A clean, blank space, ready to be filled with everything I'd set aside for others. I sat on the floor, leaned against the wall, and took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, I cried. But it wasn't a cry of pain. It was a cry of relief. Of someone who finally understood that they no longer needed to beg for scraps of attention. Of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. There on that cold floor, I wasn't a rejected woman. I was a free woman. And deep inside me, something told me this was just the beginning. Because there was so much more ahead than I ever imagined. That first night in the new house was silent. And unlike any silence I'd ever experienced, this one didn't hurt. It was a gentle, almost comforting silence. There were no voices drifting down the hallway, no loud television, no cutting comments thrown into the air. There were no hurried footsteps, no impatient glances, no slamming doors. There was just me. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. In the early days, I confess, everything felt strange. Loneliness visited me like an old acquaintance, the kind we pretend not to recognize, but know exactly who it is. It sat with me at the table, accompanied me to breakfast, walked beside me when I went to the corner store to buy bread. But, over time, I realized that that loneliness wasn't absence. It was space. Space for me. Space to breathe, to think, to exist without having to constantly justify myself. It was the fertile void where I could plant a new story. It was Marlene, a friend whom life returned to me at just the right time, who helped me through this transition. She knew I had moved and showed up one day with a basket of fruit and a smile that said she understood more than she was letting on. We sat on the porch, and she didn't ask me any questions. She just stayed. And that was enough. It was with her that I had my first laughs in so long. Shy laughs, yes, but honest. She reminded me that there was still beauty in the exchange between mature women. That time doesn't erase joy, it only teaches us to seek it elsewhere. With her support, I began to reconnect with parts of myself that I had left dormant for years. I picked up my threads and needles and returned to embroidering, as if conversing with my own soul. Little by little, the colors returned to my hands. Embroideries that had once been gifts for my granddaughter now became my own creations, bearing my name, my rhythm, my identity. A neighbor saw them, was enchanted, and asked if I could teach them. From that moment on, everything took on a new purpose. I started a small embroidery group with other women from the neighborhood. We met twice a week in my living room, which smelled of fresh coffee and mint. There, we shared stitches and stories. We laughed at mistakes, celebrated successes, and without realizing it, we were also stitching our own healings. Each woman who sat on that sofa brought a different baggage, a particular pain, a unique journey, but there was something that united us deeply. We all wanted to be seen. And there, in that small, simple space, we were. Besides that, I started painting. I'm not an artist, never have been. But I discovered in paint a way to express everything I'd never been able to say. My paintings don't go to the gallery, but they go on the wall of my house. And that's enough. They're pieces of me scattered across the walls, witnesses to a transformation that no one else sees, but that I feel every day. Planting mint has become almost a ritual. Every morning, I tend the pots on the balcony like someone tending to their own new beginning. Watching those green leaves grow in the sun reminds me that life goes on, even after everything we thought we couldn't endure. And perhaps the secret lies there. In cultivating, instead of waiting. In creating, instead of begging for space. In blooming, even after the harshest autumn. This new routine has no luxury, no grand events. But it does have peace. And peace, for those who have experienced the weight of rejection, is a priceless gift. I discovered that freedom isn't noise, nor rebellion. Freedom is being able to wake up without fear. It's drinking your own coffee without being watched, opening the window without being judged, choosing silence without it meaning abandonment. It's allowing yourself to occupy space without guilt, without effort, without having to constantly explain yourself. Of course, there are days when longing is overwhelming. We miss even what hurt us. Memory has this treacherous side, reminding us more than we'd like. Sometimes I find myself thinking about Sophie, her laugh when she was little, the stories I used to tell her to sleep. I remember the smell of her hair, the way she hugged me for no reason. These memories come like waves. Some gentle, some strong. But they no longer bring me down. Because today I know, I did everything I could. Everything. And knowing this gives me a kind of peace that no one can take away. Not even those who tried to erase my story. Because in the end, the truth always finds a way to blossom. And respect, when it doesn't come from others, needs to come from within. It needs to be cultivated within, like mint in a clay pot. Because a woman who learns to respect herself after being broken, that woman will never bend again. And it was with this new mindset that I moved forward. Not waiting for them to recognize me, but recognizing myself. And that changed everything. Because it was only when I stopped asking for space that I discovered I could create it. A space of my own. A space where, finally, I could be whole. And it was in this place, in this home newly built from the rubble of everything I had been, that something completely unexpected happened. Life has these unexpected twists and turns. When everything finally seems right, when peace has finally found a home, the past, the one we swore we'd left behind, decides to knock on the door. And sometimes, literally. It was a Thursday afternoon, with a gentle sun streaming through the window and the smell of cheese bread baking in the oven, that the sound of the doorbell made me stop. It wasn't visiting hours for my embroidery students, nor for Marlene. I got up slowly, wiping my hands on my apron, and went to the door. On the other side, Michael. There, standing in the doorway, his shoulders slightly hunched, his face thinner, and his gaze hesitant. For a second, I thought I was dreaming, or living some kind of play set up by life to test how much I had truly changed inside. But no. It was him. My son. The same one who months earlier had looked at me with contempt. The same one who silenced me with harsh words and erased me from his own history as if I were a typo. He didn't say anything right away. He just looked at me. His gaze was full of hidden meanings I didn't know. A gaze that, no matter how firm it tried to be, held something hidden that I couldn't yet name. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't rush to fill that silence. I waited. Without fear. Without anguish. Because there, in that doorway, was no longer the woman who begged for space. There was the woman who learned to live without permission. After a few seconds, he said, almost in a whisper, "We miss you." And it, said that way, with those words, sounded so out of place that for a moment I wondered who that "we" was. Because for a long time, that "we" excluded me from everything. From the table, from socializing, from decisions, from affection. And now, suddenly, that "we" remembered I existed? I felt a mix of emotions rising in my chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't forgiveness either. It was a kind of painful lucidity. A clarity that comes when the wound has become a scar and you no longer bleed for the one who hurt you. I stared at him firmly, without raising my voice, without trembling. And I replied with the calm of someone who no longer owes anyone anything. "I missed you too. I missed myself, while you snuffed me out alive." The words came out as if they'd been rehearsed for months. And perhaps they had been, deep inside my chest, on silent nights, on mornings watering the mint, on days I rediscovered myself. There was no shouting, no accusation. Just the truth told the way it needed to be told, unadorned. And it was at that moment that I realized the reversal. For the first time, he stood before me, unchecked. For the first time, he was the one searching for an answer. Some sign that there was still a bridge. And for the first time, I was the one choosing what to do with it. Michael lowered his eyes. He wasn't the same man who stared at me coldly in that room. He was a son trying to find the mother he'd driven away. But the woman he found there wasn't the same. Because when we rebuild our own history with our own hands, we switch roles. And there, in that moment, I was no longer the woman who begged for crumbs of attention. I was the woman who knew the value of her own silence. He asked to come in. I hesitated for a moment. Not out of resentment, but out of respect for everything I'd built in that new space. That floor was mine. Those walls were my allies. My corner of peace, my refuge. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and let him in. Not for him, but for me. Because I needed to see, with my own eyes, the impact of my decisions. He sat on the sofa in an almost childlike manner, like someone carrying the weight of a truth that took too long to grasp. He gradually recounted how things in the house had changed. How Sophie asked about me days after I left. How Karen, without even admitting it, began to take on roles I'd never even noticed. How the silence of my absence was louder than all my years of presence. And there, in that broken account, were the revelations I never heard when I was still there. He would say, without saying, "I understand." And that was enough. But forgiving isn't about going back. It's not about forgetting. It's simply about letting go of what no longer fits. I listened, with empathy, but also with an emotional distance I had earned with effort. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt at peace. Because divine justice sometimes doesn't come in the form of punishment. It comes in the form of awareness. And seeing that awareness in his eyes was enough for me at that moment. There was still much to be said. But I knew that, this time was on my side. Because those who spend their lives erasing others eventually find themselves in the dark. And when that happens, It's impossible not to long for the light to return. After that visit, I spent days digesting everything that had happened. Not in a rush, nor with anxiety, but with the calm of someone who has already understood that some answers in life only come when we become silent within. And it was in that silence that I confirmed something I had already been feeling. The true value of my story was never in what they did to me, but in what I chose to do with it. I could have closed myself off, hardened my heart, turned to stone. But I chose to blossom. Not for them, but for myself. And that decision, which seems small from the outside, completely changed the course of my journey. Today I understand that living with dignity isn't about luxury, nor about the recognition of others. It's about being able to walk around your own home barefoot, without fear of disturbing others. It's about having breakfast in silence without being observed. It's about feeling that your existence doesn't need to be constantly explained or justified. It's about opening the window and feeling the wind on your face, knowing that that air is yours, and that you have a right to it. I live with less, yes. But I live with peace. And peace, for those who have experienced the weight of being ignored by those they loved most, is a luxury that comes with no price tag. My days are simple. I wake up early, tend to the plants, make my coffee, write in my notebook. Sometimes I receive visitors. Other times I spend days in silence. But there is no emptiness in this. There is presence. My own. And that alone fills me more than any table full of people who don't know how to look at you. I learned the hard way that dignity can't be begged for. You can't beg for affection. You can't plead for respect. Dignity is imposed. And not with shouting or confrontation, but with decisions. With silent choices that gradually build a new foundation within. I had to break myself to understand this. I had to be forgotten by those I raised in their arms to remember me. But I got there. And I got there standing. Whole. Stronger than ever. And if there's anything I can leave as a legacy, it's not an inheritance of possessions, nor advice on how to be a good mother or wife. It's something else. It's a seed. A seed of courage that, if planted in the right heart, flourishes even in the driest soil. Because every woman who rises after being discarded is saying, without words, that it's possible to start over. That it's possible to leave the place of pain without losing your tenderness. That it is possible, yes, to rebuild your own story even after others have said you had no more chapters. Life, when we stop waiting for others to recognize us, opens up in a new way. As if to say, now yes, you're ready to live what's yours. And it was only after all this that I understood, it wasn't about cutting off the electricity in the old house. It was about turning on my own. The light that comes from within. That doesn't depend on anyone. That can't be extinguished by harsh words, nor by the silence of those who never knew how to listen. This light, which I thought I'd lost, was actually always with me. It was just covered by layers and layers of guilt, fear, and expectations. And when I stripped it all away, what was left was a woman who never stopped being strong. She'd just forgotten. And reuniting with this woman was the greatest gift life has given me. Today I no longer wait for someone to knock on my door and apologize. If they come, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. Because what I needed wasn't repentance from others. It was my own forgiveness. Forgiving myself for waiting so long to put myself first. And I achieved that. If you, who are listening to me now, have ever felt like a burden, ever believed your existence was too much, that it took up too much space, that it cost too much, know this. This is a lie. A lie told by those who never knew how to see you. But you can see yourself. You can remember. You can rise. You can choose again. Because it's never too late to light your own light. And when you do, you'll understand what I understood. You'll feel the same peace I feel now, as I tell this story with a peaceful heart and dry eyes. Because when we find our place in the world, everything that was left behind stops hurting. And everything that's yet to come stops scaring. If you've come this far with me, following every word, every sigh, every silence, then perhaps this story has touched a corner of you that not everyone can reach. And if it has, it's no accident. Sometimes, All we need is to hear from someone who's already walked through the darkness that there is a way out. There is a path. There is a new beginning. And no matter how much time has passed, or how many times you've been made to feel small, there's always a chance to light your own light, even if the whole world has tried to extinguish it. I'm not here to lecture you. I'm not a paragon of perfection, nor a movie heroine. I'm just an ordinary woman who believed too much, for too long, that she needed acceptance to have value. And maybe you believed that too at some point. Maybe you still do. Maybe you're experiencing exactly that right now, surrounded by people, but feeling an emptiness no one sees. Walking through the house you helped build, but feeling like you no longer belong. But listen carefully to what I'm going to tell you now. You do belong. You have a place. You have a story. And your story matters. Because what you lived through was not in vain. What you sacrificed, what you gave, what you endured, all of it built more than walls or relationships. It built you. And no one has the right to erase you, to silence you, to reduce you to your energy bill or the space you take up on the couch. When I found myself in that situation, humiliated in my own home, everything inside me screamed that this was the end. But it wasn't. It was the beginning. The door that closed for me, there was the same one that led me to another place. A place where I no longer needed to ask permission to exist. Where my choices were as valuable as those of others. Where my voice, though quiet, echoed. Life doesn't always warn you when it's going to turn upside down. But when it does, it also gives you tools. Sometimes in the form of pain, sometimes in the form of silence, sometimes in the form of a look in the mirror that asks you, is this what you want to keep accepting? It was at that moment that I began to build, with my own hands, a new version of myself. A version that was stronger, more conscious, more true to my truth. And if there's one thing I can wish for you right now, it's that you too find that turning point. That moment when you look around and realize you no longer need to adapt to places that diminish you. That you no longer need to beg for emotional crumbs. That you no longer need to carry the weight of those who don't know how to value you. Because there's a whole life waiting outside. A life made of choices that come from the heart, not from fear. A life where you can finally breathe without guilt. If this story reminded you of your mother, your grandmother, or even yourself, don't keep it to yourself. There are people out there who need to hear that there's still time. There's still time to get up. To pack your bags. To turn off the Wi-Fi. To walk out the door not as someone running away, but as someone who finally chooses where they want to go. There's still time to look in the mirror and say, this is me. And no one will erase me anymore. Now, if this story touched something deep inside you, if it brought to light memories, emotions, or hidden truths, leave a "no one turns off my light" in the comments. Because when you write this, you're not just affirming something for yourself. You're also shining a light on someone else who might be in the dark, waiting for just that sign. And what's more, share this story with someone who needs a reminder that dignity has no age. That respect isn't a favor. That true love doesn't humiliate, silence, or despise. That there's a kind of strength that only those who have been broken know, and it's this strength that transforms pain into wings. Because, in the end, it's not about what they did to you. It's about what you're going to do with it now. And if you've made it this far, reading every line, feeling every word, it's because something inside you has already begun to change. And change, my dear, is always the beginning of something powerful. If you've stuck with me this far, I can only thank you. Because it means that, somehow, this story found a place within you. And that's what matters most to me. Knowing that, even in silence, we can recognize ourselves in each other's eyes. If this content resonated with you, if it touched some forgotten corner of your heart, if it brought you strength or clarity, then perhaps it's time to join us on this journey. Here on this channel, I share stories that often no one has the courage to tell, but that need to be heard. If you believe in their importance, if you feel this kind of conversation is missing in the world, subscribe. That way, you'll continue receiving content that, like this one, is made with truth, soul, and respect for your audience. And if you got this far, leave a comment. This message was for me. Because I'll know that you not only watched until the end, but felt it. And feeling, these days, is an act of courage. Take advantage and leave your like too. Not for the number, but for the connection. Because each like is like a silent hug saying, I'm here with you. There's a video right here that elaborates on this topic in a special way. Click through and follow along with me there. Who knows, it might even help you see something you were missing.